Hi there, friends and fellow homebrewers. It is me, Harper, and in today's show of the Beginner Brewer Q&A, we're going to be discussing whether Michael Caine is in fact one of the best actors of his or any other generation. I'm just kidding. We're going to totally be talking about how to get started in homebrewing the simplest possible method while still making excellent beer. So cheers! Right, today's inaugural episode of the Q&A sessions. I really hope it's going to go well. I hope nothing's going to explode. I don't know what I'm doing. Bear with me. If you think that my video quality sucks or that I'm not sure what I'm doing with the lighting, you're right. I do not know any of these things. But I'm going to learn. And so I'm hoping that many years from now, I'm going to look back at today's episode and go, man, I cannot believe that I was so crap at this. Fortunately now I've won an Oscar. Anyway, let's get started. So one of the main reasons I started the beginnerbrewer.com website is because I found it difficult at the time in getting really good homebrew advice. I started back in 2003, many years ago, when I brewed my first beer at home. And ever since then, I've been making a lot of mistakes and learning from them, which is sort of the point. And I started the Beginner Brewer website. And ever since then, I've been teaching beer schools, and I've been involved in the beer industry. I even for a short time owned my own craft brewery. Maybe we can talk about that in later episodes if you're interested in going pro. But for today, I really want to sort of help you get started. And if you're going to try and get started in homebrewing right now, it's kind of a popular hobby around the world. You're likely to join a forum or a group on social media where you're going to ask advice of more experienced brewers, right? That makes a lot of sense. The problem with those sort of things is that you're going to get too many opinions being thrown your way. And some of them are going to be good and some of them are going to be really bad. And it's going to be difficult for you as a beginner brewer to figure out which is which. And so, hence the need, I guess, or the reason for my website and these video sessions, which I'm looking forward to sharing with you in the future. And to that question, if you're going to get started in homebrewing and you ask people on a forum or on social media, guys, I want to start, what's the best method? You are going to get 100 different opinions. Some people are going to say, buy a kit, buy a beer in a can, just add water, you're going to be fine. Others will say, no, don't make kit beer, rather use all grain methods. And then others, which will probably be the least helpful, are going to tell you, no, don't worry about this, just buy the 10K automatic brewery, press a button, it does it all for you. That's the only way to make good beer. And you're just starting in the hobby, man. I mean, you're not going to spend that much money, are you? Are you? I didn't think so. So today, I'm going to show you the cheapest possible way to still make excellent beer. And that's the emphasis here. I'm going to assume throughout these sessions that you actually want to make good beer. You're not just trying to make vast quantities of high alcohol swill. Are you? Are you? You're not. We're going to make excellent beer. In fact, you can make award-winning home-brewed beer using some of the methods I'm going to be discussing. So let's get started. I'm going to get right into it here and say that I would recommend as a beginner brewer that you do not start with all grain methods. It just introduces too many variables to figure out at once. You're going to make a lot of mistakes. You're going to get very frustrated. You're probably not going to make very good beer. And you might just kick that whole hobby. You might just think, no, this is just too difficult, man. I'm going to go back to buying my beer, which is a bad idea because you can make really good beer. So let's push all grain aside for now. I will be doing videos on all grain. Don't worry about it. If you're already an all grain brewer, by all means, you can wait for those, but I suggest that you watch these damn videos, man, and hit that subscribe button and hit the like button because I want to do this forever. I don't want to do this like a part-time job. Be nice. So we're going to get started on a method which is generally known as extract with specialty grains. Okay, it is not a kit beer. Okay, so we're going to kind of walk away from the kits very slowly, backing away gently, just like you would from a deadly snake. And you're going to turn around and walk away from those, right? Kit beers, even though they very easy, that's sort of the point of them, I don't think you can make excellent beer with kit. Okay, I know it's a controversial statement. Probably lots of you are going to be commenting below in the YouTube channel. I hope so, because that makes me seem as though I know what I'm doing. But I really don't think you can make excellent beer with kits. And the main reason for that is that it sort of skips over lots of basic brewing principles. And that's the other problem I have with kit beers, by the way. It doesn't teach you basic brewing methods. It has a very weird way of making beer. You know, you're kind of adding boiling water, but at a weird stage. You're not really boiling it. You know, it's all very strange. The extracts have hops already added, so you don't get to control the hop additions. You know, it's odd. I think it is really important to start with a method which will teach you the basics of good brewing practice. Basics which you can transfer into newer methods, into more advanced methods. Okay, so you're learning as you go along and you're learning good stuff. Secondly, you want to be able to produce award-winning beer right away. Well, not right away, but with practice. And I promise you, I have won awards for my beer. It is very possible to brew award-winning beer using extracts with specialty grains. And you can do this for years. Okay, I brewed this style of beer or method of beer or brewed beer using this method for many years before I transitioned into all grain brewing. And I think it was a good idea because it taught me a lot about basic brewing. It taught me about the importance of things like fermentation control. It taught me a lot about the importance of yeasts. It teaches you some very, very important basics of good brewing. So that's what we're going to be focused on today. I'm going to show you the basic gear you need to start with extract and specialty grains methodology. Let me just show you the actual ingredients because that's kind of important. Now, if you start with kit and I wanted to show you the ingredients, I'll just show you a can. But I'm going to show you something much more interesting. So, first off, here we go. So, first off, here is the main dude, the main thing. This is the main ingredient of your beer. This is dried malt extract, sort of beige in color, creamy color, and it'll make creamy colored beer. I'm not kidding, it totally will make a light colored beer. This stuff is wonderful. You can pretty much store dried malt extract forever, right? It does not go off, as far as I know. I mean, I've stored these things for years and years and have seen no difference in quality. You do get liquid malt extract. It comes in the form of a syrup. Let me get rid of that. But, you know, that is a little bit more difficult to get hold of, and it is more susceptible to things like mold growth. You have to store it very carefully. I prefer dried malt extract. Stable. It's a very good quality product in most countries, including the one I'm in, which incidentally is South Africa. But in any country in the world, you will get dried malt extract. Why? Because it's used in many other things. Many things have malt extract in them as an ingredient to sweeten and to add some oomph to it. So it's already available. Okay, what is dried malt extract? It's the process of malting barley, mashing it, extracting the wort, and then finally drying it. So when you use extract with specialty grains, you're really skipping the mashing stage of brewing, which is what all grain brewers get started with. Okay, they start with the mashing first. As an extract with specialty grains brewer, you will be skipping that step, which will make your whole day much shorter, much simpler. Okay, dried malt extract, main ingredient of your beer. That's going to form the base of the beers you make. Okay, it's also referred to as a base grain in all grain brewing. And in this case, the most common kinds of barley used to produce things like dried malt extract would be pale 2-row or pale 6-row malts. Those are usually the ones going into dried malt extract. Sometimes they use different combinations, and they maybe even add things like Munich or Vienna malts to that. But basically, it's a pale in color, okay, malt. It is usually highly fermentable. So in other words, it has a lot of sugar available for yeast eventually to ferment your beer. More on that later. And it is a pretty good, solid malt flavor. And malt flavor really in beer would be your more bread-like, your more biscuity type of flavors in the beer. Okay, so that's what the dried malt extract will provide you. But on its own, dried malt extract is not that exciting. Okay, you can make beers simply by using that alone and some hops and some yeast and water. Don't forget the water. It's very difficult to make beer without water. Anyway, you can make really good beer just using dried malt extract, but if you want to get more interesting and you want to make really, really tasty beer and you want to access more styles of beer, you're going to be adding the other component to, remember, extract and specialty grains, the specialty grains. Okay, so you're going to create a specialty grain tea. You're going to steep these grains in hot water, and that's going to release a lot of flavors, very much like when you brew tea, okay, or make coffee. Let me show you some specialty grains. Here we go. So this is in a little bag. I'm not sure if you can see it. I can bring it closer to the camera, but I'm not sure if it's focusing properly. And this stuff is black malt. This is one of the many specialty grains you can get. This is already pre-milled. You can see it's very fine. It's got a nice crunchy sound, which is probably very annoying. And this is a kind of a malt you would use in a porter or a stout style, for instance. It's very dark. It's a roasted malt. It's roasted in huge ovens. And if you add that to beer, it not only colors your beer dark, like you would have in a stout or a porter, but it adds a lot of roasted, barbecue-y kind of flavors to the beer. Okay, so you can imagine if I steep some of this in hot water, creating that sort of roasted coffee, roasted barbecue, maybe even slightly burnt flavors, and I then lay that on top of bready, biscuity flavors, we've got some beer here, right? You already have the start of an interesting, tasty kind of beer. So that's the specialty grains. We're almost there. The final component, or next to final component, you'll be adding to your beer will be hops. Okay, and that's one of the saddest parts for me of kits. Kits don't allow you to play with hops because the hop is already added as an extract into their syrups and so on. Okay, so you never even see the hops you're going to add. It's just there, you know. And unfortunately, I think it's a very blunt kind of flavor because extracted hop oils and so on are, in my opinion, certainly not as interesting or deep in flavor as if you use the real deal, the real fresh product. And let me show you the real fresh product. Here it is in its own little vacuum sealed packet. And you'll see it looks sort of like a cross between, I don't know, gerbil food gone funny and green, or maybe cat litter. I'm not sure. You don't want to be thinking about cat litter when you make beer. It's nice green stuff. Okay. This one here is Northern Brewer. It's a type of variety of hop. And often when you buy hops from your local homebrew supply store, it'll be packaged very much like this. It'll tell you the variety and it will also tell you the alpha acid. And this particular Northern Brewer has an alpha acid of 7.3%. Don't get too worried about these right now, we'll be covering it. But generally speaking, the higher the percentage, okay, the more bitter the hop, the lower the percentage, the less bitter the hop. Okay, basic rule of thumb, easy to remember. 7.3 incidentally is sort of in the middle of the range, middle lower range really of hop, so it's good flavor, reasonably good bitterness. And folks, there is literally hundreds of different varieties of hops from around the world. In fact, different countries specialize in different kinds of hops generally and are even known for those hops. So for instance, in New Zealand, there's some specific hop varieties which you can pretty much only get there. Whereas in America, there's lots and lots of really cool hops, citrusy hops, so-called C hops are mostly grown there. In Europe, Northern Brewer, in fact, is grown in Europe mostly. So this is the hops. It's pelletized, so that it's really just processed hops. It gets picked fresh. It's a little cone, grows in these huge trellises. It's picked, it's processed by having it cure, and then it's pelletized just by putting it through a sort of a dye, and it's extracted into these little pellets. So there's nothing really added to hops, it's just age and the curing process. There's a lot of varieties of hops, and hops impart a lot of different flavors to beer. If the grains and the dried malt extract have the roasty, biscuity, caramelly kind of flavors, the hops adds a lot of the top notes and the bitterness to a beer. So dried malt extract, if you taste it, extremely sweet. Okay, it tastes sweeter than sugar. So you can't make beer which is that sweet. How do you get the beer to balance out? How do you make it taste like beer? Well, you add hops. Hops is very bitter. It's one of its properties, and so it balances out the beer, and it makes for a tasty, balanced beverage. And on top of the bitterness, hops can also add other interesting flavors, like tropical flavors for your IPAs, for instance. It can add earthy, herbaceous notes for some of your English and European ales, and a whole bunch of stuff in between. But the cool thing about using extracts with specialty grain method is you get to add your own hops, and you get to play with your hops. I don't mean play in a kind of a weird kinky way. I just mean like in a brewing kind of way. You know, that's one of the cool parts of brewing your own beer, is you get to add hops just like a pro brewer would. I mean, pro brewers, if you ever visit a brewery or go on a brewery tour while they're making beer, you'll see pro brewers with huge bags of hops, look just like this, toss it into the kettle while it's boiling and so on. So you're doing the same thing here, folks. It's no different. Okay, so that's one of the things which I like about this method. It teaches you basic brewing methods which you could eventually transfer into a professional brewing career if that's what you're into, but you don't have to. So hops, really cool stuff. And apart from the water you're going to be using, which is important, it's a lot of it, you're going to be using a lot of water, so you must make sure it's the right kind of water, and we'll be getting into that in future episodes, I'm sure. You're also going to finally use yeast. Now, I don't have a yeast packet here with me because I'm not very well prepared for this, obviously. But yeast comes in all shapes and sizes. Usually you have two varieties. You've got liquid yeast or dried yeast. Liquid yeast usually comes in these little tubes, little test tubes, and dried yeast in little packets. Now, don't underestimate the importance of yeast. Please do not underestimate the importance of yeast. Don't do it. I know you're gonna, but you shouldn't. And I think the reason why some brewers underestimate the importance is it's the tiniest component. It's in a little packet. If you're using dried yeast, it looks completely unimportant. How could this little packet have anything to do with all this beer I'm making? But it turns out that yeast is perhaps the single most important ingredient in beer. It is ultimately what turns a sweet, or in the case of wort, a sort of a bittersweet liquid into beer. Without yeast, all you have is a mess. You would never drink that stuff, folks. It'll be horrible. Yeast does two very important things. It adds a lot of flavor. So number one, it adds a lot of flavor to the beer. And in some beer styles, it's almost the entire flavor component comes from yeast. But in most beer styles, yeast has an important flavor component. It can add anything from a sort of a very yeasty flavor to very earthy flavors, up to barnyard kind of flavors. It can add really fruity flavors in ales. It can add very crisp, spicy notes if it's a lager yeast. So there's a whole bunch of things which yeast will add for you. And the second important thing it does is it converts sugar into alcohol and CO2. So it eats up a lot of that sweet sugar. Okay, it is a fungi, by the way. That's what yeast is as an organism in terms of where it fits into the plant kingdom. And it converts some of the sugars in your wort, which is the liquid you'll produce at the end of the boil. More about that later. It'll convert it into alcohol and CO2 and flavor. Okay, the flavor compounds it releases during fermentation. And at the end of that, you will have beer. Okay, it even carbonates the beer for you if you're going to use naturally carbonate or natural carbonation methods. So yeast is super important. Okay, it's the brewer's friend, and in fact, some people would say, I'm one of them, that you're really the servant of the yeast. Okay, all you need to do as a brewer is get out of the way of the yeast to make beer properly for you. You are basically setting up the conditions for yeast to operate on your beer and make it for you. Okay, so don't get cocky. You are not the brewer, the yeast is, I think. Okay, that's it for ingredients. Now we're going to move on to the gear you'll need. And that's really the star of the show today, and the thing I wanted to discuss with you most. So if you're going to start with extract and specialty grains, the nice thing about this method is you don't need a whole bunch of equipment. In fact, if you're going to start with small batch brewing, which is also something I would recommend, and by small batch I mean something like brewing 5 liters to about 10 liters of beer. For those of you in America, I can't remember what the gallon sizes are, but I'll probably post it over here. So you're going to start with small batch brewing. A 5 liter batch is still a lot of beer. So don't think it's not, right? That is a whole bunch of beer. That is a number of bottles of beer which I can't calculate in my head, but I will be putting it right over here on the screen. I'm doing it right now. That's a lot of bottles of beer, people. I think it's a very legitimate, very cool way of getting started. It means that you don't immediately produce a big 19 liter or 5 gallon batch of beer. I mean, it might seem cool, you know, I've got 20 liters of beer, but you still have to bottle all that stuff, y'all. You know, you're going to have to bottle it in a bottle. This is not going to take 19 liters of beer. Okay, you're going to have about 50 or even more bottles of beer at the end of it. Where are you going to store all that, right? Do you have a fridge big enough? Okay, what if it's really bad beer? I mean, you're starting out. It's not unlikely that you will make some mistakes along the way. You can't get rid of 20 liters of bad beer other than just dumping it down the drain. You can drink the stuff, but you're not going to enjoy it. You can give it to other people, of course, especially your enemies, right? That's what I would do. Give it to your enemies. But maybe you don't have any enemies. Maybe you're a really nice person. Are you going to give that to your friends? I promise you, they're not going to stay friends with you for very long if you give them really, really bad beer. I'm getting sidetracked again. But a 5 liter batch, much easier to handle. If you make a mistake, it's not a big deal. You're not going to, cry about it. And what's another great advantage of small batch brewing is it uses equipment you probably already own. You don't have to go out and buy more. One of the very first things you're going to need when you brew extract with specialty grain method is you're going to need something to boil your wort in. Wort, W-O-R-T, that is the name we give to the liquid eventually, which we turn into beer. Now, in extract with specialty grain method, unlike kit methods, we are going to do what is called a full volume boil. So you're going to start with all the liquid you're going to need and which you will eventually put in the fermenter to ferment out into beer. Okay, and in other words, if you're going to start with a 5 liter batch, which I would recommend, you need about 7 or 8 liters of beer. Why? I mean liquid. You need 7 or 8 liters of water. Why? Because you're going to lose a lot of that volume through boil off and through absorption and so on. Okay, so you're going to lose some of that volume through boiling. So you're going to start with more than you will eventually put in the fermenter, and so it stands to reason that you need some kind of vessel to boil at least 7 to 8 liters of liquid in, and this is what you're going to need. It's right over here, folks. This here is my handy little stock pot. This is a 10 liter stock pot. It's very, very adequate. It's an adequate volume for brewing small batches of beer. I can brew anything from a 5 to a sort of a 7 to 8 liter batch of beer in here. If I need more, if I want to brew a larger volume, then I will need to get a larger kettle or stock pot in this case. By the way, in brewing we have different words, of course, like any hobby, and we don't like calling things pots and stuff like that. We call it a kettle. Okay, so you boil your wort in a kettle, even if it's not really a kettle as such. It's weird, I know. You're going to need one of these bad boys. Now, a stock pot is particularly important because it helps you achieve a rolling boil. You want a very vigorous boil when you do this. And a stock pot concentrates the liquid nicely to have the flame underneath if you're using gas or the electric hob of your stove or whatever you're going to use. Don't use wide pots. Okay, so a stock pot is a stock pot because it is taller than it is wide. If you use a regular old saucepan or something like that, which is generally wider than it is tall, it's going to be very difficult for you to achieve a good rolling boil. But a stock pot, no problem. Even in a reasonably small stove or oven or kitchen setup, you can achieve a rolling boil for a 5 liter batch of beer. And maybe you already have one of these, maybe at the back of your cupboard, because you probably don't make a lot of stock. But this is a really, really good piece of equipment to get. So that's one of the first things you're going to want to buy. A nice, solid stock pot. And in the case of small batch brewing, like I said, it's going to be a 10 liter or so. The other thing you might want to get is a big spoon. Okay, I've got a couple of examples here. Whoa, that's noisy. So you can get a big old wooden spoon. Don't know if you can see in the video, there's a slotted metal one peeking out. Spoon, you're going to stir stuff. Okay, you don't want to have clumpy things going on in your brew, so you want to stir, especially when you're adding dried malt extract. So that is your spoon. Before the boil in extract with specialty grains, remember I said you're going to create a tea out of your specialty grains. You're going to steep it. Now obviously if you just chucked all the specialty grains loosey-goosey into your kettle, it's going to be a messy thing because it's all going to lie at the bottom and make a big old mess. So you want to contain them in something, and that something, folks, is this. So this is a brew bag. It's a big one. You see that? Hello. Okay, this is a brew bag. It is made out of a fabric called Voile. V-O-I-L-E, Voile. It is the same fabric used to make those funny little curtains. I don't think anyone really uses anymore, but it is often found in the curtaining sort of world. You can have one made for you. You can buy these at homebrew shops. Not too difficult. Now generally the size of the bag, a good method, a kind of a neat trick, is make sure that your bag is big enough so that the pot you're going to use, the kettle you're going to be using to boil in, will fit into the bag. And then you know the bag is big enough. Bigger is better, by the way, because it means that if you have a big enough bag, you don't have to buy multiple ones. Okay, this bag, this is a really big one, it's a really big one. This is big enough for a 30 liter or a 40 liter stock pot, okay, to fit into. But it doesn't make a difference if I use it in the smaller stock pot. There is very little difference in using a big bag in a smaller pot. Obviously, you cannot fit a small bag into a big pot. Okay, just doesn't happen. So that is your brew bag. You're going to be putting those grains in there. You're going to be putting it in the stock pot. You're going to be adding hot water, somewhere around 60 degrees to 70 degrees Celsius. I'll have to put the Fahrenheit numbers underneath because I'm not good at converting those in my head. And you're going to be steeping it for about half an hour to create your grain tea. And then you're going to be taking that bag out and you're going to get rid of the grains. A lot of people ask me, what do I do with those spent grains? Well, there's lots of things you can do, but that, folks, will be the topic for a different episode. That's what you need. You need your grain bag, and we're pretty sorted. Now, there's just a few other things you'll need to get started in this brewing method. And some of these things you probably do not own, but let's stick with things you probably still have in the cupboard somewhere. And one of the things you want to measure in your beer is temperature, okay? And one of the best things to use is, of course, a thermometer, not your finger, okay? Your finger is not an accurate scientific instrument, so don't be fooled, okay? This is a probe thermometer. This is one you would maybe stick into a roast, or if you're not careful, into yourself, so be careful. A digital one, it can even convert Fahrenheit and Celsius, which is pretty cool for me. Pretty accurate, these digital thermometers, and they come in different shapes and sizes. This one is just fine. Another one, which I have handy here, is this one. This is a sugar thermometer. It's used primarily for syrups and sugars when you're baking. Also a probe here, little readout, just as good. If you have one available, you can use that. And then you have the old-fashioned stuff, which still I kind of like, and it's very accurate, which are the glass thermometers. And they come in these nifty little protective tubes. Okay, they're not filled with mercury anymore. They're filled with alcohol, or spirit. And these are very, very accurate. Problem with these are they can break. They're made out of glass. They have a tendency to roll off tables. They have a tendency to be stepped on. They have a tendency to disappear. These things have a tendency not to get into the tube again. So be careful if you use these. I've broken a few of these along the way. It's always sad when you break a thermometer and you have to, spend a lot of time cleaning up. And if you break the thermometer in your brew, which is not unlikely, you got to chuck the brew, because who wants glass in their beer? You want the beer in the glass, you don't want the glass in the beer. Keep that in mind. Okay, the other thing you want to measure is weight, right? Not your own, but the ingredients which you're going to be using. It is not good enough to use cups and teaspoons and tablespoon kind of measures. Okay, we're not baking a cake here, people. And in fact, if you bake a cake, you probably don't want to use that either. But if you're brewing beer, you want to be pretty accurate. So if you're going to weigh out your grains, for instance, your specialty grains, or your dried malt extract, you're going to need a scale. I recommend investing in a nice little digital scale. Digital scale, here's a typical one. It can go up to 5 kilograms, which you won't need. You're not going to measure out more than 5 kilograms for small batch brewing, and not even for large batch brewing, unlikely. You may want to also look at a gram scale. Now those are super tiny little ones. I have like a fool forgotten mine. I'll show it to you in future episodes. But they are gram sensitive. In other words, they can measure a fraction of a gram, where these ones can measure in 1 gram increments, which is fine. It really is. But if you're going to do a lot of small batch brewing, sometimes you need very small quantities of things, like you may need 5.4 grams of hops, for instance. And whilst you can certainly use 5 or 6 grams, if you are a little bit of a nerd like I am, and you want to be super accurate, a gram scale is something to get. You can buy these at head shops, okay? It is very popular. The gram scale is popular with people in the informal pharmaceutical entrepreneurial business. And that's pretty much where you're going to get those. So scale, you've got weight. So we've got temperature, we've got weight with the scales, and the third thing you want to measure is gravity, okay? And I'm not talking about the gravity of the earth, that's pretty constant. But if you want to measure the gravity of your beer, which really is just a measure of the amount of soluble materials in the liquid, it's the density of the liquid, it tells you a lot about your beer. So the gravity will tell you about how much dissolved sugar is in your beer. It'll tell you about how much of that is being fermented out by your yeast turned into alcohol. And that's one of the things you use gravity readings for, is to measure the ultimate alcohol volume of your beer. And it has many other uses throughout. So I would recommend just getting something to measure gravity. It's not the essential. If you can measure temperature and weight, you're okay, and you probably already can with the equipment you have in the kitchen. But if there's one thing you want to buy in addition to a thermometer and a scale, it is a hydrometer, which is one way of measuring gravity, or a refractometer. I've got both, so I'll show you first the hydrometer. It's also a very delicate glass instrument, so you've got to be careful when you handle it. I've got to be careful when I handle it because I'm not looking what I'm doing. Also comes in a nice little tube, looks like this. Okay, and you are going to take a sample of your beer, and you will be floating it in a little test tube, and you take a reading. That's how you get to the gravity of your beer, using a hydrometer. But again, sensitive things, prone to breakage, so be careful with them. They're relatively affordable. They're not too expensive. If you want to go pro, I'm kidding. If you want to spend a lot of money on measuring gravity, you can buy one of these. So this here, I can't help but think that these things look like a lightsaber. So this is very much the brewing lightsaber. This is a refractometer. Works very differently. It works on the principle of different densities bend light in a different way, refracts light in a different way. You put a bit of you put a very small drop of the sample underneath this faceplate. You close it. You look through the eyepiece over here, and there's a scale inside which you then take a reading on. It tells you the gravity of a beer as well. Pros and cons in both. I mean, the main con of this bad boy is the price. So these are not cheap. Okay, they are expensive. So you don't need to get a refractometer right away. The advantage of a refractometer, though, is if you do a lot of small batch brewing, you don't really want to take a large sample. If you take a 200 to 500 milliliter sample out of a 5 liter batch of beer, that's a significant percentage of your actual volume. Whereas the refractometer needs a couple of drops at most. So it's very economical from that point of view, but not too economical from the purchasing point of view. So once you've boiled your ingredients, you're going to have to cool them down. Now there are many different ways of cooling down your wort. The simplest way, without having to spend much money at all, would be to immerse this thing into a bath of ice. There are pieces of equipment you can purchase later, things like an immersion chiller. So it's basically a bunch of coils which you run water through. You stick the coils into your wort, run the water through, and it will cool it that way. There's something called a counterflow wort chiller. These are pretty complicated methods of cooling, but it is important, and but they are expensive. So I wouldn't necessarily invest in those right away. If you happen to be handy, you can make them yourself. I'm not. I have almost no mechanical skills whatsoever. Once you've cooled down your wort, you need to put it in something to ferment, and that is called the fermenting vessel or fermenter. Now the pros use these huge steel tanks. I'm sure you've seen them. They're big conical fermenters. They've got jackets around them to keep the temperature stable. Unless you have mega bags of money, you're not going to have one of those. So what most homebrewers start with, and it's certainly perfectly adequate and you can make incredibly good beer with it, is a typical plastic fermenting bucket. What you're going to be using is this bucket. This is a tiny bucket, so this would be adequate for a 5-liter batch of beer. And you get bigger buckets, so the bigger the batch, the bigger the bucket. Stands to reason, right? And you want to have a bit of headspace in your fermenter. You don't want to fill it right to the top. That's not a good idea. So your fermenter is always going to be a larger capacity than the amount of beer you're going to make. And it's going to have a lid. I don't have a lid here with me for reasons unknown. And the other piece of equipment you're going to need once you've got your beer in the fermenter is an airlock. An airlock is going to fit into the lid, and I just so happen to have one here. This is a bubbler style of airlock. You get different styles of airlock. There's sort of a more cup-shaped one. They're all doing the same thing. The main reason why you have the airlock, please listen to me carefully, because if there's one thing which I see more often than any other on these social media forums, is people asking whether their fermentation is stuck, broken, destroyed because this thing is no longer bubbling. Okay, that is not something you need to worry about. Okay, I'm going to say it again. Inactivity of bubbler airlock action does not equate to fermentation being stuck, destroyed, or gone. Because the main reason of this thing is not to tell you whether your beer is fermenting. The main point of an airlock is to keep the outside out and the inside in. So it is here to prevent bad things from getting into your beer while it's fermenting. Okay, it's an airlock. Think of sci-fi, right? I'm a sci-fi guy. You've seen things like The Martian and other movies. They have airlocks, right? The airlock is there to keep, the space outside and the air in. It's very much the same here, only it's a little bit opposite. An airlock's going to fit into the lid. It's going to have a little cap on here. You're going to fill it with liquid. So usually a sterile liquid. It can be water. Some people use distilled water. Or any liquid which will generally resist bacterial growth. I prefer using vodka. Vodka is high alcohol. Bacteria find very difficult to grow in that medium. So you put a little bit of vodka in here, and then what it does is the CO2 which the yeast is creating in your beer in the fermenter gets released through this airlock. Okay, so it starts bubbling. Yes, when it starts fermenting, it will start bubbling. So it prevents the lid from popping off. Or I guess under extreme situations, your fermenter from bulging out and exploding or cracking, because it's a violent process, this fermentation. So the CO2 gets a place to escape through, and because it's a lock, it's an airlock, and it's got a sterile liquid in, air from outside cannot go into your beer. Okay, so not only does air contain perhaps wild yeast, bacteria, and other things which can mess up your beer, but it also contains oxygen. And oxygen is super scary for brewers. It is really scary. Oxygen is sort of the Freddy Krueger of brewing. You don't want it anywhere near your beer, okay, except for one part, but I'll get to that later in future episodes. So this is the airlock. This is the one thing you're going to probably not own. If you have this in your kitchen, you probably already brew beer or you're a weirdo. But other than that, you're going to get these at our homebrew store. But remember, folks, if the bubbling stops, it doesn't mean anything, okay? I'll get into that in a future show. But this is really just to keep the outside out and the inside in. With that, you have pretty much everything you need to ferment your beer. How do you get the wort into this fermenter? You just chuck it in, right? You take it out of this, you throw it in there. Doesn't matter if it's pretty, in fact, it's good if it foams and goes a little bit crazy. How do you get this beer in the fermenter out into a bottle, which is mostly what most homebrewers start with? They're going to bottle their beer. This is a 440 ml bottle. That's a little bit more challenging. So some fermenters are fitted with a tap on the outside, and you just run a tube and into a bottle like this. If you don't have a tap and you want to try another method, you will use a method called racking your beer, which is another brewer's term for moving beer around. And the way you're going to do that is with a racking cane. But if you really want to go a little bit more luxurious, and I would say this is the one piece of kit, the one piece of gear I would spend a little bit of money on starting out. Believe me, if you quit the hobby, it will be not difficult at all to sell this piece of kit to a fellow home brewer, because we love these things. And they are called auto siphons. So this is the auto siphon. This is not a piece of medical gear. Don't worry about it. Auto siphon. These are really cool, but not cheap either. I don't know why, but for some reason, maybe in your country they're affordable. In mine, not so much. But it is a worthy investment. Now you've got the beer in your bottle. Now obviously you need bottles. I've just shown you a typical example. You can buy clean new bottles from your homebrew supply store, but I don't actually understand why people do that, to be quite honest with you, because there's a much nicer way of creating empty bottles. I wonder if you can guess what that might be. I can't possibly think of what that might be. So maybe consider other methods of creating empty bottles for yourself. Washing them out, good idea, of course. And if you are going to reuse bottles, it's a good principle that once you've poured out the beer, because you are going to be pouring out your beer in a proper glass, right? We do not drink beer out of bottles. We are not in NAM right now, okay? There are rules, okay? So you're going to be putting it in a glass. Just take your now empty bottle and swirl some water around and chuck it, rinse it with water, and put it in your dry rack, because that's a good discipline to start cultivating, by the way. Don't leave it there to clean later. It's not going to be great. It's going to be difficult. So we've got bottles, and the final part of this whole beautiful equation of making your own beer at home will be that you have to seal that bottle with a bottle cap. Okay, we don't use twist on, twist off bottles or caps in homebrewing. It's not a good idea. They don't seal very well at all. We are going to use something called a crown cap. And a crown cap is a cap which can only be removed with a bottle opener. Okay, proper bottle opener. This is what they look like. Okay, so these are uncrimped. They are sort of wide open, and you need a device to crimp them onto the top of the bottle neck, and that is called predictably a capper. There are different styles of cappers. You get bench ones, popular especially in the wine industry as well. But this is the typical one many people start with. Okay, this is sort of a butterfly style capper. You put the cap inside of this section here. It's got a little magnet which helpfully holds the cap in place. You place it on the bottle and you go like this, and you apply a little bit of force, and it crimps the cap securely to the bottle. And you can use this thing. This is the very first one I bought, by the way, and I'm still using it. So this thing is more than, I don't know, 15 years now? 15 years old. It's starting to show its age, much like the person using the capper. But it's still going strong. So if you treat them properly, they will last a long, long time. Now you've sealed your beer, and now it's just time, right? You're going to condition your beer for a bit, and we'll talk about the methods and some of the other things you're going to do in order to get there in future shows. But a couple of weeks later, you're going to open up. Very satisfying to open up your first homebrew. You're going to hopefully hear that comforting hiss of CO2 escaping. And you're going to drink beer you made with your very own hands. That, my dear friends and fellow homebrewers, is the gear you need, the very essential minimum gear you will need to brew beer at home using extract and specialty grains. That's it. You don't need anything else. So go out there, go buy the things which we spoke about today, and go brew beer. It's that simple.